Welcome everyone to another stream of me talking about issues regarding public transportation. This week's topic, chosen by a Patreon poll. My Patreon is, if you want to contribute, and if you don't, then you don't have to. Patreon.com/AlonLevy. The chosen topic with 11 votes is underrated transit projects. That is, public transportation lines that cities should be building but aren't. It beat number 2, which is how to convert a lightly used or disused freight rail line for urban rail service by only 1 vote. That option got 10 votes. And public transportation and comprehensive planning for developing world megacities, which had 8 votes. So this was not a polling wipeout, and I'm likely to do the number 2 and 3 choices in the next 2 weeks. So first of all, what do I mean by underrated? I mean locally underrated. I mean lines that, for whatever reason, are not being built that the city should be building. Now, the problem is, I personally can name you a 2-digit number of these, and this is only out of familiarity with a handful of cities. I imagine that globally the number is deep 3 digits, and let's even play it in hard mode, excluding cities that are out of poverty and high construction costs together, not building a metro system at all or barely building one, like Lagos. Which the problem in Lagos is not that they're underrating transit lines. The problem in Lagos, they understand that they need a metro system. They're just building a very small one because due to poor resource allocation, high construction costs, local poverty, they barely have the budget to build something. So even excluding these, I believe there's deep 3 figures just out of things that, let's say, Paris, any number of smaller French cities, a number of Chinese cities, much of Japan and so on should be building but aren't. So I can only do a selection. So my selection is going to be biased, and the primary source of bias is that it's easier for me to talk about cities that I have lived in, but not just. So I'm going to skip Tel Aviv actually, and the reason is that Tel Aviv has problems with the metro network that it is building, and this includes both what is called the Tel Aviv Metro, which is a very long-range driverless system that is only in the planning phase, and what is called the Tel Aviv Light Rail, which is a subway surface system. But there's no line that screams "build me" that isn't being built. It's practically tabula rasa over there. So I'm gonna skip over Tel Aviv, and I'm gonna skip over Singapore, and I'm gonna go to New York. Just in order of where I live. Now, talking about lines in New York that should be built but aren't is not hard because New York is barely building anything. And the reason New York is barely building anything is that the construction costs in New York are very high. The budget, for example, for 2nd Avenue subway, which for people who are uninitiated, 2nd Avenue subway is a 3-kilometer extension that is not currently being shown on Google Earth because Google Earth, for some reason, is not showing the recent expansion of systems in any number of cities. This is the line. So it's from 96 and 2nd to, with stations at there, 86, 72nd, and then over here it curves a little bit and goes over here to 63rd and, no, not over here, sorry, over here, and then it curves west here under 63rd and hooks into existing tunnels. So it's a line that fundamentally is this long, a little less than 3 kilometers. That cost $4.7, I believe, billion. And phase 2, which I'm assured has learned a lot of lessons from phase 1. So this is, you keep going north, it stops at 106th, 116th. Then over here with 125th, you don't just stop at 2nd and 125th because that area is kind of desolate. Instead, you curve underneath 125th Street. So if we instead of line, we do it in path, it might be easier to see what we're talking about. This is a shorter line. Also, many of these tunnels already pre-exist. So the actual stations at 106 and 116th do not, but the segments between them were already dug to some extent in the 1970s and will be reused. So they go up until about here. So 2.8 kilometers, and the budget for this is $6 billion. So this is so in New York, because they're building for $2 billion per kilometer, my actually paid research project right now is understanding the differences between different cities' construction costs. Namely, how come New York is so goddamn expensive, where $2 billion per kilometer is not normal. Global median, as I wish to remind people, is 250 million. So this is practically all of China. This is pretty common in France and Germany, although there have been some recent overruns in France and Germany, sadly. And then you have, you also have countries that are more expensive than global median. Generally anything that speaks English is expensive nowadays. It wasn't always the case. Singapore wasn't 20 years ago, neither was Canada, but that was 20 years ago. And today they are among the most expensive countries in the world, but still not $2 billion per kilometer. It's in American dollars, not saying, or Canadian, it might be 600, 700, 800, and these are, again, and Toronto, again, it's had a lot of problems. And so in these places it's really expensive, and of course global median means half is less. So many things that are cheaper than 250 million per kilometer. For example, Southern Europe is cheap, Scandinavia is cheap, South Korea is cheap. In South Korea, and generally when you have a cheap country, it will build more. Madrid, for example, went from 150, I believe, kilometers of subway 30 years ago to 300, one of the projects that got funded before the Great Recession put a stop to the expansion. So they roughly, I believe, doubled the extent of their metro in 20 years. This was done in the context of extremely low construction costs that unfortunately have not been exported very well to other countries, often because other countries that it could be exported to tend to look down on Spain rather than up to it. But I'm not going to talk about the causes of high construction costs. The point I'm making is that in New York, thanks to high construction costs, very little is being done. That said, even what is done is not necessarily following high priorities. The most glaring example of this is not actually from 2nd Avenue Subway. 2nd Avenue Subway Phase 1 was an amazing line, if anything, underrated. Despite its extreme construction cost per kilometer, its construction cost per rider was actually, I believe, well below the average for an American rail project. 2nd Avenue Subway Phase 2 is roughly treading water. The real whopper is that Mike Bloomberg, on his own accord, got city money for something called the 7 extension, also not shown on Google Earth. And that can't even be a lack of update. I got this computer well after it opened. So this is the 7 train. The 7 train goes, so it's this one. It's one of the east-west lines in New York City. And the outer end, Flushing, is, I believe, the busiest station. Pre-corona, the busiest station outside Manhattan. It's a decent-sized secondary business district. It's a really important ethnic, cultural district for, I believe, Chinese New Yorkers, and I believe maybe also Korean New Yorkers. And there have been plans to extend it outward, but Bloomberg doesn't care. Bloomberg wanted to do urban renewal in this part of the city called the Far West Side, or Hudson Yards, and therefore he built something like this, and wouldn't even build a station over here at 10th Avenue. The argument was the area is already developed. So this was also a very expensive line. And the ridership, I mean, it's there, but it's nowhere, not particularly consonant with a budget for it, unlike Second Avenue subway. So again, even New York has prioritization problems, but I do want to talk about things that New York should be talking about, and probably would be first priorities to look at as soon as there's any way to reduce construction costs. So this is not going to be the New York crayon session. The New York crayon session, as I said, I think a week ago, is something that I'm actually getting paid for to figure out what New York could build on roughly, let's say, the current MTA capital plan budget, which is extensive. We're talking $40 billion for a 5-year plan. And it's not one plan that's only happening because of some kind of stimulus project. These are recurrent 5-year plans. The MTA in New York has many dedicated sources of funding. And so what could this budget build if construction costs in New York were normal? So when I say underrated in New York, I mean lines that are so obviously good in my opinion, and yet not frequently talked about, unfortunately, that they should be at the top of the list. So I would say that, let's say that Second Avenue subway phase 2 has been built, which is almost certainly going to happen even at current costs. So something important to know about Second Avenue subway phase 2 is that the tail tracks are going over here. There's not going to be a station over here, but the tail tracks are going that way. And they could, without too much trouble, go like this. So that would be an east-west line underneath 125th Street. This is the main commercial street of Harlem. So not a terribly important job center, but a really important cultural center for the Black New Yorker community, in the same way that Flushing is for the Chinese New Yorker community. And it's not just the Black New Yorker community. It's also it's an important thing for the national African American community. There are entire cultural references in Black lexicon that reference specific things on 125th Street, like for example the Apollo Theater. So this is so as one might expect, it is an important commercial street. It may be the busiest bus in New York City, and thus in North America, per unit length. Now, this is not necessarily easy to tell, and I would like to show people the New York bus map for a moment. So here's the New York bus map. This is the Manhattan one. They do it by borough. Most east-west streets have just one bus. The north-south ones often interline. So up on 3rd, for example, down on Laxar, 3 lines plus 1 rush hour line. Ditto Madison, up Madison, down 5th. But the east-wests, there's 66, which is a bus that goes roughly on 66th Street. It's a one-way street, so this is why it's kind of a weird route. 72nd, same thing, it just doesn't go through the park, so it's weird. 79th does go through the park. 86th goes through the park. 96th goes through the park. 106 is a very restricted, or it's not. I think it's daytime only or something. It doesn't go through the park. It's not that important, the street, compared with the others, so it just merges into 96. 116th, a very important street in east and central Harlem. Also, separately, an important cross street in Morningside Heights, which is here, that's where Columbia is. But it's not really used as an east-west drag because it's in the middle of campus. So yeah, you can walk it, but it's not in a commercial street. So the 116th bus is also not as big. Now, but there's no bus on 125th. or rather, there's no single bus. There are, on the map, 4. There's the BX15. This is a bus that goes east-west and then runs on 3rd Avenue in the Bronx. There is the 101 here, which goes on Amsterdam, so that would be to Washington Heights over here. Diverts east-west through Harlem and then becomes north-south up 3rd down Lex. There is the 60, the M60, which goes from Morningside Heights. It's kind of stereotypically the whitest route, but I mean, it's still a Harlem route. Fundamentally, it's I used to use it from time to time because when I was around Columbia, that would be the route. It's a route that got extra investment. This is where you see the pluses for bus stops. It means the bus is slightly faster, and I emphasize slightly. And it goes to Queens, so it goes to Astoria and then LaGuardia Airport. This is why it's kind of overrated. I mean, it's generally common to overrate airport transit. And then finally you have the M100, which goes east-west on 125th, and then just goes up Amsterdam and then Broadway, much deeper into Washington Heights, and then even into Inwood in the far north of Manhattan. So 4 different bus routes. None of them is one of the top bus routes in the city, the way that, for example, the M86 kind of is, or so the single route with the highest ridership per kilometer is the M86. And number 2 is the M14, so that's a bus that goes on 14th Street, and then branches either on Avenue A or Avenue D. In general, by the way, when you crayon, you want to look at where the buses are when the city has wide streets for buses. If the city has a very obstructed street network, then buses aren't going to be a very good guideline. But in a city like New York, they absolutely are. So the point is that these are all buses that also have other segments, so you can't tell, but I believe that if you take each of these 4 buses, so BX15, Manhattan, 60, 100, 101, and divide each of them by route length and add these together, then you actually get more than the M86. I believe it's 30,000 people use the segment on 125th Street, and it's about 3 kilometers. So again, very busy road. Also importantly, the route would provide really important crosstown connectivity. Let me see if I can find my New York not crayon. So I believe this is called Queens Subway. But this may be, or maybe New York NYD interlined. NYC0. I think this is this one. And it's gonna be, and it's entirely possible that this is the one. That is just the base map. So this is where I have to show a map of colored lines. So I promised no crayon. And I'm doing my best at this point. As I said, I'm not crayoning. I'm just talking a little bit about underrated lines. I'm not crayoning a city. Yeah, okay, this is the system as is. I'm making the only changes. I mean, the colors are moved around a little bit. The rule here is de-interlining, which means roughly if 2 lines don't share tracks through the city core, they don't share tracks elsewhere. So this is why. So if you're familiar with the city, you know that the colors of this line is correct, but the colors are kind of flipped. I emphasize kind of. But it's kind of showing you where the lines are. And something important to note is that you're not getting east-west connections north of Midtown. 2nd Avenue Subway actually is really good for this, because for the first time from the Upper East Side, you get a 2-seat ride, so a ride with just 1 transfer, to the Upper West Side. Beforehand, I mean, you could take the 456, that's the Green Line, but there's no actual connection from here to anything that goes whoop. There's 3-seat rides, so for example, 456, 7, 1, 2, 3. And if you're wondering about this junction, there's no station here. You can't use that even. So the 125th line would go like this, and that would create an east-west line north of Midtown. It would be really good for connections. For example, there's lots of jobs around here for the Weill Cornell Hospital, and it would connect West Side destinations like. So this is not. So Morningside Heights would be kind of weird to get there. So Columbia so that's Columbia, which is the biggest job center in uptown Manhattan. I could show it later on the map if people want, but it will connect things like Washington Heights over there. It will connect parts of the Bronx that don't have as good connections to the Upper East Side. So overall, very good connections to uptown Manhattan job centers. Very busy bus. So they should already be thinking of it as the next phase. It's kind of like the phase 3 of 2nd Avenue subway, in lieu of the actual phase 3 that they're planning, which is to break the rule that if two lines don't share tracks in city center, they don't share tracks outside. They're going to take this branch and move it down 2nd with a new color, underneath 2nd Avenue, which in Midtown is not that much of an important street. I mean, it's a wide street, it's an important street, don't get me wrong, it's Midtown, but it's kind of peripheral for Midtown. The jobs kind of start at 3rd. So instead of making that your phase 3, just don't build this and make this your phase 3. That would be a good priority change. So I think that is kind of underrated. I mean, I do know that there are planners at the MTA who like the idea. I once talked to a planner who said that it would be a really cool thing that they could build if in a kind of fantasy scenario. So it's not that like I invented this and no one else had heard of it. But that would be a really good example of an underrated line. Things that didn't used to be underrated by R. So this street, the one that so right now it's there's a red train and a green train here and as well as here. So this is called Nostrand Avenue. This is one of the busiest bus corridors in Brooklyn. So in the same way that I showed you guys the Manhattan bus map, let's look at the Brooklyn bus map. So this would be bus BKLN. Give me a moment. So this would be here. So again, it's more cluttered than in Manhattan because Brooklyn's street grid is more cluttered. So this is Nostrand. Not this one, this one. So the street is actually partly one way, and for rather dumb reasons, there are two versions of the B44, one of which, so both of them go southbound on Nostrand, but they have different choices of where they're going northbound. Is it the next major north-south street to the east or to the west, instead of making this just a two-way street and telling business owners to park one street away. And so this is one of the busiest buses in the city, and I don't have a good list for this. The link turned into a table that I don't want to download right now. But I believe this. So this is, I believe, the second busiest in Brooklyn. The busiest is the B46, which is Utica, which I'm going to get to in a moment. So both of these streets in post-war expansion plans were considered to be the next subway routes to be built after 2nd Avenue subway is complete. So for Nostrand, you're not going to go on Upper Nostrand. You're just going to take this branch and go whoop to Sheepshead Bay. With Utica, this map doesn't show this very well. So the line has 4 tracks up until this point, up until Utica. And right now the 4 train, which is green, terminates there, and the 3, which is red and runs local, keeps going up until here, up until No Lots. And the plan was to build a kind of curve from here under Utica and go here to Kings Plaza. Now, these plans remain very good because New York subway expansion is generally good. Now, I know that there are people who are kind of skeptical of them. So Yonah Freemark is a Utica skeptic on the grounds that the density here is not amazing. And for example, Kings Plaza, the mall over here, I mean, it was a really important shopping mall back when shopping malls were new. So that would be in the 1970s, for example, but nowadays there are other competing malls and it's not as big as it used to be. So I don't want to turn Utica into the next Second Avenue, it really isn't. It's still a very strong route though. So that should be on basically any plan. I mean, I think Mayor de Blasio, so I know that Mayor de Blasio said that it would be a good idea. I don't know what came of it. Basically nothing happened publicly, but there may have been some behind the scenes planning for it. So that would be a really good route to build. It would also be cheaper to build because the land use is such that you can just cut in the middle of the street and there aren't enough residential buildings that it would be that disturbing. There's a lot of auto shops. So that is underrated, but I don't want to exaggerate how underrated it is. It's underrated because again, New York subway expansion is a good thing, but it is to some extent the New York of yesterday. And in Nostrand, maybe to some, I mean, New York has been undergoing, I want to say, slight de-Brooklynization, in the sense that downtown Brooklyn, for example, is a less important business district than it used to be. At the time the subway was built, it was so important that they would specifically try to feed everything through downtown Brooklyn. And at this point, Long Island City may have overtaken it as the city's #2 business district. And I think I mentioned this before, on the map is not very good for figuring out which is better. Sorry, not which is better, which is bigger. Because on the map, I think all of the teachers maybe are reported to be working at the Brooklyn Borough Hall. So lots of public sector jobs are misreported as being at Borough Hall or at City Hall. So Borough Hall looks a lot bigger than it is, but you can't just net it out because there are people who work at Borough Hall legitimately. But the point is that downtown Brooklyn, which used to be by far the biggest non-Manhattan business district in the region, is at this point near tied with a new build. So Queens would have big ones, and because we're talking underrated, this is not something that you can see with buses very well, but Northern is actually very good for this. And the reason you can't see this with buses is that people around Northern can just take the subway. The buses, I mean, it's close enough to the 7 that people can walk. It's not kind of beyond the subway, it's just that the 7 is very crowded over here. And in general, subway lines in Queens are very crowded. The problem is that then you need to figure out how to get Northern into Manhattan because all of the tunnels between Queens and Manhattan are very crowded. So maybe doing something that is Northern, let's say up until here, because beyond that you really should just do better LIRR service. So maybe anything that's just going like this. Now, if you know the subway system very well, or if you noted something about this map, at this point Northern has a subway. This is the express tracks of this line, so this is why you don't see stations here, but you do see stations here. The idea is that the locals go whoop, whoop, whoop. The express tracks divergent go direct and don't stop. So if there were a way to, I don't know, dig underneath here, I mean the land use here is stuff that probably can be redeveloped anyway. So if you were to build this, then and find a way to not interfere with the existing tracks here, and then figure out some way of getting into Manhattan, which I'm not going to talk about because that's too much speculative planning, then that would be a good thing. That's kind of like the more modern New York, which is a little less Brooklyn-y and a little more Queens-y, if that makes sense. Okay, I am being asked questions, so I'm going to, okay. So I'm going to answer them right now. Yes, Google Earth has usability problems. Is it? I think I asked you this last time, but I don't remember. Is it pronounced Mnim? Anyway, It's not the MTA paying me. I wish the MTA paid me. My project from Marin, at which I'm a research scholar, for which the vast majority of my income comes, is to do a global comparison of construction costs. So our construction cost database is part of that. But this also includes case studies, because there's a point beyond which just saying this costs X, that costs Y is not that enlightening. So instead we're looking at the specific issues that lead New York costs to be extremely high, other American costs, and to some extent other Anglosphere costs very high. I wish we could do French and German costs why they're medium kind of, but we don't have the budget to do that many cases. So instead we're looking at why it's cheap to build in Milan, to some extent the rest of Italy, Istanbul, and Stockholm. And this is what I mean by I'm getting paid for this. One of the things the project will include is, once we figure out what costs we can promise in New York, that is, which construction cost problems can be fixed with relative degrees of ease, which are too difficult and which are just impossible, then we will crayon what New York could be building at the current size of the capital plan. Okay, so there's the burn. Have I seen videos of Amtrak testing? The locomotives don't tilt. Yeah, in general, the locomotives on tilt trains that are not EMUs don't tilt. It's also true for the Talgo. It's also true for the SNCF experiments. The tilting trains that are not EMUs only tilt the passenger cabs. They don't tilt the locomotives. I mean, there's no reason to, because whenever it comes to axle loads, the tilting doesn't matter. The tilting is not going to change the distribution of mass on the tracks. The tracks and the bogies don't know that the train is tilting. So, so in terms of maintenance, it doesn't matter. So the only thing that it would do is slightly improve driver comfort. Oh, hi, Michael. Would I extend Second Avenue subway to the West Side line with a new station? The answer is yes. So I have heard people propose a really weird hybrid alignment of the 125th crosstown, where you're gonna go so what I'm proposing is this. So this means you're going like this. You have stops at Lenox, aka 6th, aka Malcolm X. You're going to have stop at 8th and a half, aka St. Nick, for the connection to the ABCD. And you're going to have a stop at Broadway, aka, which at this point is like 11th, for the connection to the 1, which is elevated here. Google Earth will even kind of show you. The issue is that this is a valley. So you can kind of, I don't actually know if you can see this. Okay, now you should be able to. So the elevation here is 6 meters. Now, the names of the neighborhoods might clue you in that Morningside Heights is on a hill. You can see it's not 6 meters, Morningside Heights. It peaks at almost 40. And likewise over here, this is West Harlem. They call it Hamilton Heights or Hudson Heights, and it's also quite high, so they just bridged over this valley. And by the time they built the IND, so that would be here, first of all, the gradient is much smoother. And second, even when they did go into big height changes with Washington Heights here, and when they just built deeper to stay underground the entire way. But anyway, yeah, this is the correct way. The incorrect way, which I've sometimes seen proposed, is to go here and then hook into these tracks, because because over here there are 6 tracks of which 2 are kind of superfluous. So there are these plans to, let's do a direct train from here to 125th. Please don't do it. Like there's already a lot of different branches. Just go here. I mean, it's also really important because remember, the top job center in uptown Manhattan is Columbia. So this is not quite Columbia, but it's close. And Columbia is expanding over here. Which much of the neighborhood of Manhattanville does not like, but I mean, the people who lived in Manhattanville 10 years ago didn't like it. The people who are going to live in Manhattanville in 10 years are going to be Columbia students and faculty and staff. So anyway, this is the New York portion. I'm going to look again to see if anyone has other questions regarding New York, and if not, we're going to talk about things that are not New York. Okay, looks okay. So this was New York, and now let's talk about some other cities. Now, after living in New York, I lived in Providence. Providence does have an underrated line. This is a line that I'm going to outsource to Peter Brassard, who I'm currently working with at Transit Matters, but I think Transit Matters didn't even access them. So the idea is this might also go into disused freight lines, to be honest. It's not a disused freight line, it's an active freight line, but it's not very active. It's, I want to say, 8 trains per day in each direction. By a railroad, it's called the Providence and Worcester, because if you look at where the line continues, it goes to Worcester. So you go within the state. So this is Woonsocket, which is a deindustrialized town in the Providence orbit. You go on this line, which is not very straight. This is fine. You do this, and you can do it either DMU or EMU. I mean, I think 10 years ago we said DMU, but at this point I'm going to say just electrify. And then you hook into here to the Northeast Corridor. This is Providence, but you don't stop at Providence. I mean, you make the station stop, but you don't terminate there. You continue, and you continue on the Northeast Corridor. This is a branch that could be reactivated, but it was on the plan. The plan was just to keep going, and I think the original plan was to go up until Warwick. And if you're British, forgive me. It is not my fault. The Americans pronounce it Warwick and not Warwick. And you can even go farther than Warwick. The commuter trains today, in addition to all of this, keep going on this high-speed track, mucking it in the process, to a station that I'm not sure it's going to be depicted. It's called, it is Wickford Junction. You can kind of see how well developed this entire area is. They believe they would get 1,200 riders per day out of this. I don't know how much they're getting. I mean, not now, pre-corona. I think they're an order of magnitude off the projections. It means that Rhode Island got so burned they refused to build rail, which it's actually a pretty common theme, regrettably, that you build a bad rail line and it underperforms, and that saps the political will to build good rail lines. So, and at this point, Rhode Island is, even knowing that the line is a failure, is so committed to it that it's difficult to speak of regional rail without including at least some trains that run through to Wickford Junction, even though, again, the state of Rhode Island understands that this is not a successful line. If you talk about just extending better service from Boston to Providence, Rhode Island says, well, we're paying for service to Wickford Junction. Why are you taking that from us? So the idea was to do a local train, like an S-Bahn type train, running maybe every 15 minutes from Woonsocket to Warwick, on the existing track. And the idea is to figure out how to share the tracks with freight, which is not that big of a deal. A bigger problem is actually intercity trains. You would need to 4-track everything. The right-of-way used to be 4 tracks, but they reduced it to 3. Widening it back to 4 is possible, but the compromises on distance between tracks might be unpalatable for high-speed intercity rail. I'm not sure. And if you widen, you could widen the underpasses a little bit, but that's money. But anyway, this would be with a lot of intermediate stops. The problem is that there's this mentality that commuter rail is for rich people, not for poor people. Now, in Rhode Island, if you ride public transit, you're poor. Okay, speaking as someone who lived in Rhode Island for a year, without a car. Um, I'm trying to remember how often I rode public transit within the state, the buses. And even though I did have BRT, in fact, the first BRT in America is in Providence because there's a bus tunnel. I don't think it's depicted very well here, but so I'm gonna look for it for a moment. But there is that. So over here, look at the elevation. The elevation over here is basically sea level. Now the elevation over here is not. It's 40. This is called College Hill for a reason. So so the trolleys back in the day couldn't climb it, so they built a trolley tunnel that I'm hunting for right now. Oh right, it's not. It's this one. So this is a trolley tunnel. You can kind of see the portals of the trolley tunnel over here. And this gets you underneath the peak of the hill to over here. This is Thayer. This is the other portal. This is the kind of neighborhood center of College Hill. So Brown, the university, most of the buildings are over here, the retail's over here. Because universities in America tend to not think that people ever eat at home. There's no supermarket here, so actually there's a grocery store, there's like a bodega, but the supermarkets here were actually a problem when I lived here. I had to walk all the way up until here, and you could kind of see that it's designed for drivers. And my point is, even while having this former trolley tunnel, currently bus tunnel, I used it uphill a little bit, but even that not much, and I barely used any other bus in the city. And so the point is that if you're riding public transit in Rhode Island, it's probably because you don't have a car. Now it's different if you're riding if Boston is involved at either end of the trip. So it could be you're a reverse commuter. That's absolutely a thing. Another postdoc at Brown, currently, I don't want to say currently, as of when I last saw, I believe tenured professor at the University of Washington. She's very good. She has a two-body problem. Her name is Bianca Virai. She and her partner were both very good, so they got multiple offers and went to University of Washington, but while postdocing, they were two different unis. She was at Brown, he was at either Harvard or MIT, I'm forgetting which. So they lived in Back Bay, so that he would take the subway in Boston, where very much not just poor people who ride the trains. In fact, in Boston, if you don't look at riders, you look at commuters. Average income in the Boston area for public transit commuters is actually a little bit higher than for drivers, because so many white-collar jobs in downtown Boston are accessible by rail. And then she would reverse commute and have to show up ridiculously early in the morning, like an hour before class, because the reverse commute trips the trains only run every 2 hours. But that would be like a high-income couple. I mean, people mock academics for not earning a lot of money, but two postdocs together was even than six figures. Barely, but still 6 figures. And likewise, you can kind of see near Providence Station that there are buildings here that are very clearly modern. And this is even when a lot of the older buildings in the city, this is the tallest building in the city, it's called the Superman Building, because the Daily Planet building looks like it and may have been based on it. This building is empty. It's from the 20s. But there is a little bit of construction near the train station. I mean, you can kind of see the architectural style. Those buildings don't look like they were built in the 20s. So a lot of it is residential for commuters to Boston. So these people ride trains. But there's this idea that in Rhode Island, you only ride public transit if you're poor. Conversely, there's this even more pernicious meme, which is commuter rail is only for the rich. So even so I know of advocates within the state who oppose the idea, for example, opening a commuter rail station as infill within the city, not in downtown, but for example around here in Olneyville, just because just because the idea is that, oh, Olneyville is so poor, why would they ever use a commuter train? That's only for the rich. So there's this kind of pernicious idea that you can't do this because commuter rail is dedicated to the middle class, not to the working class. And this is one of the reasons why this is not being pursued. There are other reasons. I mean, commuter rail in America is kind of expensive. As I said, Rhode Island was burned. But because of this and other reasons, this line is being severely underrated, and instead they're trying to figure out some kind of weird, really short-range circulator. They pitched it as a streetcar, and now they're making it a frequent bus, I think, that's going to hit the train station, downtown. I think that there are versions for the jewelry district, which they... so you can kind of see the remains of the freeway. The freeway used to go like this. And then they moved it to be like here, so the jewelry district got reunited with downtown Providence, and they're trying to redevelop it. And so trying to maybe send something there, maybe send something up the tunnel. Again, something very short range and very downtown circulator, which is not the usual way people use public transit. It's usually connecting downtown to something, to like a residential area. So in that case, it would be places like Olneyville, Hartford, like that direction, South Providence, like here. Or sure, I mean, also where the rich people live, which is around here. I mean, the east side. That's totally a thing, but it's not going to go just through a tunnel. It's going to go farther up or something. And my point is that, or maybe to East Providence. And my point is that this line is being underrated, and it would also mostly serve the working class because, as I mentioned, the rich people of Providence, they do exist. They mostly live on the east side. So this is the favorite quarter of Providence. So a little bit of Providence history, because people who, because I can expect a lot of people who watch this to be at least somewhat familiar with New York, just because it's such a big city. I mean, if you're interested in public transportation, you may have looked at the minutiae of the New York City subway. Providence is different. Providence is a much smaller city. So first of all, you may know that it's an incredibly old city. It was, I forget what year, I want to say 1637, by people fleeing the Bostonian theocracy. And they founded the Baptist Church, which was supposed to be a lot more liberal. And the first place of settlement was actually this slope, so kind of the west slope of what is now College Hill. So the city kind of grew around here, and this was the docks, India Point. And then gradually the city expanded to like down the hill, so this was called Down City. And I think this was actually a reference to elevation. This was before the downtown, the term downtown, which I believe the etymology of the term downtown is from New York, where it's physically north and south. But this was, again, separate, so it's called Down City. And the thing is, you can see that you have these little streams here. So these streams powered water mills, so you started getting factories on the west side, and maybe around here. So I know that I think the first factory in America or something like that was something called the Rhode Island system, was, I believe, somewhere around here. So again, another stream. So the point is that because here they didn't have the factories, and they did have Brown University, just because colonial America, New England, Boston, Brahmins, except not Boston but Providence. So this kind of became the better off part of the city, and everywhere else was industrial working class. And again, it's not just because, for example, this area, so the southern part of the east side, Fox Point, had a lot of Portuguese immigration, so historically white working class. But the proximity to Brown meant gentrified early. So historically this is where the wealthier people live. This is not a very new thing. It's a shock to everyone. I am an RPG nerd. Now, if you're an RPG nerd, this means you play D&D, but you also play not D&D. One of the things that I've played is called Cthulhu, and H.P. Lovecraft kind of famously lived in Providence. I think he has to be the most famous author from Providence. And it was active in the 20s and 30s, so usually Call of Cthulhu RPG campaigns are set in that era. You will see campaign books that explain to you the social situation of Providence, for example, in the 1920s, and even then, this was the rich part of town. Maybe not as far down as Fox Point, but certainly College Hill. And in the 20s and 30s it was very different. I mean, the Superman building was very ritzy. The Biltmore Hotel, so it's this one, was considered very fancy, and nowadays it's a throwback to the world of 100 years ago. I think the building, so it's not quite worthless. The Superman building was said to be worthless. The Biltmore, I think, is $15 million, which is still a pittance for a building that size. But the point is that the railroad, just by coincidence, it's not because the working class grew near the railroad, usually the other way around. So that line that I just erased would mostly serve the working class. Woonsocket is a very working class area. And again, I don't think that is quite why it's underrated, but the elite doesn't think about these neighborhoods very much, and especially they don't think about them in the context of commuter rail. So this is something that's absolutely underrated. Now, keeping on the New England theme, when I was in Providence, I socialized in Boston a lot. And in Boston, I don't want to say regional rail is underrated because Transit Matters is pushing regional rail. So yes, the governor underrates it, but the governor underrates everything. The governor of Massachusetts does not believe in public spending. He does not believe, he barely believes that there should be any kind of public sector. And to the extent that there is a political alternative, that is literally Transit Matters. Transit Matters really needs to be thought of as the shadow Ministry of Transportation in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, with Jim Eloisi advising as the former Democratic Secretary of Transportation. Almost, I like to say that our Executive Director, Jared Johnson, is in effect the shadow Minister of Transportation in Massachusetts, to the extent that it has political opposition, which it kind of doesn't. The Democrats are very transactional. They're not much of an opposition party. They don't think that way. But things that are on our radar, like regional rail or even North-South rail, I'm not going to call them underrated when literally the only party that proposes, the only political faction that proposes major investment backs that. But there is a thing that's maybe a little more out there, which is called the Urban Ring, which is has a lot of versions. I'm going to draw one of them, and I'm going to draw a kind of restricted one, which is going to start from Sullivan and roughly this line. It's a line that should be a subway. I think at one point they decided to make it to make it BRT, which is kind of ridiculous given that these are not very wide streets. You're not getting dedicated lanes on these streets, and even if you did, the buses would still be slow. So it's roughly through these. I'm trying to pick up the busiest stop on every Green Line station. So it's either Harvard Avenue or Packard's Corner. Historically, the commuter rail station was here in Allston, but they decided to move it to this rail yard for some Harvard urban renewal. So you go Packard's Corner, this is I believe called Coolidge Corner. Yeah, Coolidge Corner. Brookline, you can either go here and then wend your way back to Ruggles, or you can go here to Longwood, because there's actually a lot of employment around here. It's called the Longwood Medical Area. It's kind of like between this stop and this stop, so go ploop to Ruggles, and then find your way to JFK UMass, which is this. So that would, I mean, they even have some kind of plans on this street. And I'm drawing the line very rough because I don't want to cram too much, but this is a thing that, I mean, I don't want to say underrated because I mean, remember, there's exactly one group in Massachusetts that affirmatively proposes literally anything resembling a state public transportation plan, and I am a member of that group. And the big the big ticket priorities I'm very deeply involved with. And so kind of by definition, things in Massachusetts can't be underrated because the government doesn't do anything and we're the opposition. So, I mean, or rather, they can be underrated, but I'm not going to think they're underrated. So other people might say, hey, Alon, I think your prioritization is wrong and you should stop talking about regional rail and talk more about the urban ring. But my point is that this is something that's very good, but as maybe the next step. So again, it's underrated, but I don't want to exaggerate the underratedness compared with, let's say, the Providence line that I showed before. Okay, so let's now go to Vancouver. In Vancouver, the problem is not priorities, the problem is high construction costs. Or rather, the problem used to be priorities, but finally, after building several lower priorities first, for political reasons, they're building the next priority. This is Vancouver. So there's the Expo line, so there's this kind of weird curve that you might be able to see here. This is because this is a historic rail tunnel that connected this rail yard with this rail yard. It is a single track rail tunnel, but it's so tall that they managed to have two tracks, one on each level. So this is very much a reuse. The Expo line was built to reuse infrastructure as much as possible, to be very cheap. So it goes whip, 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 whip. But this is a few elevated seconds. This is a historic interurban to something that was called BC Electric, and is also currently the power company, BC Hydro. SkyTrain is a different company. So this is going to New Westminster, and then New Al's going to Surrey, or parts of Surrey. So it's the Expo line. This is the branch. Then they built this branch and then did this loop-de-loop back over here with no track connection, called the Millennium Line. And then they wanted to build a line from VCC Clark under Broadway as a subway to UBC. This is the busiest bus in Vancouver, the 99B line, alongside the local overlay called the 9. So Broadway is the busiest, I believe, bus corridor in North America. It is, I believe it's the busiest in North America also per kilometer, excluding New York, because the New York crosstowns in Manhattan. Manhattan is very long and narrow, so the east-west things in Manhattan are very short. So that's hard to get high ridership per kilometer. But I believe excluding these, Broadway might actually be still the number one per kilometer. I think it's definitely higher than, for example, Geary in San Francisco. So you have this line, and it got bumped in favor of some line that political power brokers in Richmond wanted, which is called the Canada Line. This is Richmond. So they built here with a branch with the airport, and they were thinking, oh, and now Broadway? No. They built something called the Evergreen Extension, which is undepicted as many new things are, which starts from Lougheed Town Center and goes bloomp, 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 bloomp. And I don't want to say it conflicts with commuter rail, because it quite serves the same places, but where it serves both, it has way higher ridership, because even though commuter rail dumps you at Waterfront, and the Millennium Line dumps you at VCC Clark. So, and yeah, this is downtown Vancouver, not this. Because commuter rail in Vancouver is run only at rush hour and charges a premium because it's North America. Finally, they are building the what is called the Millennium Line extension, but not to UBC because construction costs doubled on the way. They were promising to build this thing, so VCC Clark. No, I don't want your line, I want a path. So VCC Clark, tunnel like this, roughly. I'm not going to depict the alignment with literally as a curve because I don't remember all of them. So this line, so 12 kilometers, was supposed to be 3 billion Canadian dollars, and then costs magically doubled, and now the 3 billion are give or take, are only going to build to Arbutus. So they're only building to Arbutus. Much to the relief of the NIMBYs who live in Kits and Point Grey, but their time will come too. I mean, it's understood that they're going to extend as soon as they get money. They literally just released a plan that I'm actually going to look for right now because it's a really cool map. And nothing on that map looks missing. So it's possible that Vancouver just doesn't have a Vancouver future rail plan, maybe? Oh, yeah, so I actually did once take a bus to Pawtucket. There is a gaming convention that I stopped going to because I stopped living in Providence. I was subsequently told had harassment issues, called TempleCon, which also is associated to a gaming store called The Temple in Pawtucket. And because the buses in Providence are so terrible, I would walk 7 kilometers there to buy board games, or D&D source books, not D&D Pathfinder, same difference. Okay, this is not the map. This might be the map. This is a map that I saw on Twitter. The problem is Twitter is not very searchable. There is a search function on Twitter. I mean, it is surprisingly bad. So, okay, is there going to be some kind of table of contents for me? Transit. Okay, so this is the extension that I mentioned. They're also doing an extension outbound from Surrey to Langley, where I used to play board games. So I used to play board games at 2 places, mostly in Vancouver. One of them I mentioned in a previous video was not Middletown, it was around Edmonds, so closer in, more people, a very nice host, the one who believes that George Zimmerman did nothing wrong. The one in the asylum, that was the name of the gaming group, that was Langley. So that one did not believe that George Zimmerman did nothing wrong, and I will leave it at that, because Vancouver is still Vancouver. And but anyway, I mean, the plans that we're talking about, I believe they were talking about a line on Hastings, which is really good. So the busiest bus corridor in Vancouver is Broadway. Number 2 is, I believe, a near tie between Hastings and 4th Ave. And 4th Ave is just a really fine for Broadway. So Hastings kind of is legitimately the next subway. And probably they should have a deep station over here for SFU. But because of the enormous elevation difference, so look, even like in the built-up area, maybe it hit 100, and here 300 something. They're talking about building a fucking gondola, elevated over like all of these buildings to, I believe, Production or University, because you can kind of see that the streets here are incredibly twisty. So this is, I mean, if Hastings were not a good subway corridor, I would not dump on the gondola plan, but Hastings is a very good corridor. But again, I don't want to say underrated. They're planning this. Hastings, something underwater to North Vancouver, possibly even another north-south around the Arbutus rail corridor. A cross down on maybe 41st Street, which is so I believe the corridors go as following: Broadway, Hastings, then 4th, then Commercial, which is this one. No, it's not this one. This is Clark. Commercial is this one. And then it's 41st. And this is, even though it doesn't even hit Metrotown, 49th is the one that hits Metrotown, but 41st, the 41 bus has higher ridership. So they're talking about something along this corridor. So again, generally good plans, just the construction costs have kind of exploded in the last 10 or so years. Okay, now this brings me to Stockholm, where I don't really have much to add, as I told you at the beginning. Stockholm has a very radial system. I don't know what their capacity issues are. I know that they have big capacity problems on the red line, so that would be this line. This is the red line. It's a very highly branched system, you might notice. So this is the trunk of the red line, only extends one stop past city center, and so it's still basically city center, just not the Centralen. And then there's one branch that goes up until here to Ropsten, and then another branch that goes up until here that's serving both the main universities, so KTH where I was, and also NU, and Stockholm University. And then it wends its way up to Danderyd, which is I believe this is actually Sweden's wealthiest municipality. Like the favorite quarter of Stockholm's suburbanization is this one. It's just this area. And you can kind of see a lot of commuter rail here. Yeah, the reason the commuter rail is still open, even though it's a weird narrow gauge line that they wanted to close, the reason it still exists is because rich people use it. So the point is that, and then at the other end of Tessentralen, there's this really cool cross-border transfer system between the red and green lines. So green goes like this, north, and then south, green goes like this, and horrifically branches. One of these branches is to be taken over by an extension of the blue line. This is the blue line. Again, lots of branching. So they're extending the blue line from here through Södermalm to take over, I believe, this branch, and also branch to Nacka. And then the red line is not being extended. There are two branches over here. The green line has three, of which are going to cut one and give it away just to give more space for the other two lines to run more frequently without leading to even more traffic on the trunk than there is. And then so extensions include blue line over here. That's the biggest one. One of the outer termini of the blue line over here gets extended, and there's a branch of the green line which is weirdly going to be called the yellow line because they thought it was going to be a separate line, which is going to leave from Udenplan, which is here. There's also a regional rail line that was again not depicted. So this line used to have two tracks. They built another two-track tunnel just for commuter trains that goes whip with the station, whip. So they're gonna build a branch of the green line to around this direction. Kind of short one. Now, nothing here screams build me. And part of the reason is also that Stockholm is one of the YIMBY. So Stockholm is the birthplace of the word YIMBY, as a movement for more housing. Stockholm, separately, is also one of the YIMBYest cities in Europe, not intentionally, it's just that it's so expensive, and there's lots of rent control in Stockholm, but as I understand it, the issue is that the for sale market is unregulated, and you can always build for sale. People don't have to rent it out. So the market is so strong that and because of issues with tax revenue, so first of all, the marginal resident, if you build new housing, is going to be rich because it's going to be a for sale building and sale prices are high. And second, the issue of municipal taxes in Sweden is such that the incentive for cities is to get more rich people living there. So my understanding is that this is why there's a lot of construction in the Stockholm area. I know that the state also tries to encourage it. I don't know to what extent it matters. I know that in Oslo, the Fornebu line, which is an extension of a metro in Oslo, is being built by the state as a kind of, we will build you a subway because we know that you want an easy train for your 9 to 5 white collar downtown jobs, and in exchange your ritzy town has to approve more housing. And I don't know if that's also what's going on in Stockholm. But in Stockholm they are building, again, they're not building Asian levels of housing, or I shouldn't say Asian, East Asian levels of housing. But they're building a lot by European standards. I think something like 7.5 units per 1,000 people every year. So the point is that a lot of the subway extensions are bundled with redevelopment, and they're bundled with residential TOD. There's a YouTube algorithm, and you're gonna when I turn on YouTube, you're gonna see all of the terrible music that I listen to and all of the StarCraft. Let me see if I can find it. Yes, you're free to. Okay, I'm gonna do Stockholm and hope that YouTube maybe. Yeah, so there's this person on YouTube. I think this is this person. Yeah, it's Stockholm's Hjärta. This is all of this is with English subtitles. Who does lots of really cool posts about existing lines and also about future plans. And one of them, he talks about the TOD that is planned in these extensions. And one of them, they're taking a factory that's being closed down and replacing it with residential. So anyway, this is Stockholm. Nordpad. This is a really good question. So, radial circumferential mix. So in the same way that I said that when you draw a subway line, if two services don't share tracks in city center, they shouldn't share tracks outside city center. When they do, I call it reverse branching, because instead of a normal branch where, let's say you have where you have trains that share tracks in the center and then they branch out farther out. This is kind of the opposite. You have two trains that do share tracks farther out and they branch in city center. Don't do that pretty much ever. The other thing that I like slagging on is something called radial circumferential. This is when and actually the New York map is really good for this. This is when a line starts heading toward city center and then moves away from that. So historically, when this line was built, the Queens Boulevard line, so first of all, the blue and orange thing was kind of different. So the idea is that the idea when they built it was that this tunnel to Manhattan would be the blue and orange tunnel for the express trains to here and here, and then the local trains would be this kind of weird lime line, the G train, which doesn't go to Manhattan. So the idea was that this would go. So this would connect Brooklyn and Queens, so this would be the local line here, which I'm currently depicting in blue, then going on this, and then it would be the local version of this line going up until Church. And there's also, so this part is 4 tracks, but they only use 2 because there's not that much demand from Brooklyn. So right now the G train doesn't go just until Bergen Street, which is here, it goes up until, it used to go until here, which is Smith Nice, and I think it's been extended to Church. So the point is that it starts out radial and then turns into a circumferential. So going around city center. This is a bad idea, and in New York they realized this maybe without understanding the principle. So they kept having to add more service on the Queens Boulevard line that would hit Manhattan. So they actually built a connection that I'm not depicting on this map. Where yellow trains, so that would be Broadway local trains, would kind of turn into the local trains on Queens Boulevard. And then, in addition to the G train, and then they removed the G train here and built just another orange service that runs local here, in addition to the F, Returns Express. So it's kind of a mess, and fundamentally people want to go downtown, not to secondary centers, even not downtown Brooklyn. That said, in Vancouver, Broadway is demonstrably a very strong bus corridor. Yes, there are also buses that go from Broadway to downtown, like the 14, but they actually have less ridership than the buses that go down Broadway, because people just connect to SkyTrain at Broadway City Hall. Second, Broadway City Hall is on nothing. So this is, and I mean, yes, this isn't downtown Vancouver or anything, but it's close to downtown Vancouver and it's easy to get on. This is like 2-point-something kilometers, and this is not a difficult to use line. So that's not that bad of that's not that bad of a thing. This is kind of the periphery of downtown, but it's still downtownish. It's not like building a line that goes here and then, let's say from here you would branch like this. Like it's not that much of a detour. So thanks for the question, it's really good. How much is Vancouver's cost per about not using couldn't cover? Some, but not all. The plans even 10 years ago were to do Broad Tunnel. And then costs doubled. And I don't know why. We could investigate this, but I mean, we're not funded for infinity projects. For infinity case studies, we're funded for 6. So anyway, that's Vancouver. That is Stockholm. Less bad. Paris is actually really good for, and I don't know if I have good. I mean, I have crayon for Paris, but in Paris, there's actually a really good example of something that's underrated. And the problem is, it's really hard to depict Paris. I mean, I can show you. I mean, there's this crayon, but the basic problem with Paris is that first of all, the construction costs in Paris have exploded in the last couple of years. Grand Paris Express. I think it might still be the global median because it's such a big project that even shifting up a little bit might just shift the global median a little bit up with it. But maybe this point so expensive. No, actually, probably more expensive than the global median because I know that back before the cost overruns, it was the global median, but it was kind of like toward offset a little bit high toward the global median, if that makes sense. So so a little cost escalation would make it above the global median. And it's like poor project management. A lot of American problems actually. And at this point, they decided to go design build, and then there was another cost overrun because that's what happened when you do design build. But anyway, Paris kind of neglects the RER. The RER in Paris has really poor reputation. Now, if you read my comments and read the comments of Michael James, you might not realize this, but people within France hate the RER and the TERs. They think that commuter trains are for suburban criminals. It's so bad, the way they think about it, that when you have trains that go from Gare du Nord on the RERB, whip, to the airport, off-peak every 15 minutes a local train, and every 15 minutes a non-stop train. It's pretty good. They still think they're bad. For example, these suburbs in between have a larger concentration of black people and Arab people than French people who are white feel comfortable with. And bottom line is they're building 2 different airport connectors. One is a Charles de Gaulle Express. It might, I think, use these tracks and then divert to Gare de l'Est, which is actually farther away from where people want to go. Because mostly if you want to go to Paris, I mean, this looks like downtown, like the center of Paris, but people mostly want to go here, and the connections from Gare du Nord are better. Like the high-end hotels are mostly here. Then the part of Grand Paris Express, which is very unpopular among area transit advocates for its poor cost effectiveness, is M17, which is going to be kind of a weird branch from M14 that's going to wend its way through Gonesse and then head to the airport. And anyway, the point is that, so this is overrated and we're talking about underrated. So investment in the RER is underrated. And in particular, this line is extremely overloaded from Gare du Nord to Châtelet, to Les Halles. Normally, lines with different letters or colors on the RER. Let me see if I can find a map of the RER, actually. Don't share tracks. I mean, there is a little bit of reverse branching, don't get me wrong. This one. Okay, so this is a vector map, so it's going to be weird to load. So you see that there's kind of duplication. So there's this duplication of red and green here, but these are different tracks for red, which is RERA, and green, which is RERD. But blue and green, between these two stations, they share tracks. They don't share tracks at the stations. They have dedicated platforms, which helps with capacity. In theory, the tunnel is supposed to carry 36 trains per hour. In practice, 32, and even then there are cancellations, mostly foisted on the D. So this should be four-tracked. And in a study from, I think, 2003 said it would cost 700 million euros. And since then they've found ways to scope creep it to 2 to 4 billion. This is maybe 3 kilometers. So it's not being built. By the way, the reason it's not in our database, in our database we do not include cancelled projects. We include projects that are under construction, projects that are complete, projects that are about to begin construction. We don't do cancelled projects, and the reason is that cancelled projects have an upward cost bias, right? I mean, one of the reasons a project might be cancelled is it's too expensive. So a cancelled project is likely to be more expensive than one that goes through. So we don't want to compare a cancelled project in Paris to an uncancelled project in New York. We might compare it to a cancelled project in New York, but that's a weird comparison. So they found ways to scope creep it with a lot of new platforms, new stations, mostly because they don't want to do any kind of disruption, even though they've done similar disruption for reconstruction of the RERA. So this should be four-track, just to provide a lot more capacity on the RERB and D. And also there are lots of commuter lines, less so to the south, but more to the north, that are just not connected with the RER, that they could if they had more capacity on the RERD. So generally, this is something really underrated, and instead they're building metro extensions, which is not bad or anything. I mean, Paris investment in the metro is not bad. It's just they're neglecting the RER. They're extending the RERE, so it's the pink line, over here, and having it go. Not, I don't think they're taking over this line, but they're instead taking over the express tracks of this and continuing much farther west, but they're not taking over enough branches or some weird thing with weird kind of not fall through running. But so this is something that's underrated in Paris, RER expansion, so this is a good example for tracking. And finally, my current city, which is Berlin. So in Berlin, there is a theme to what is overrated and what is underrated, and I mentioned this maybe a month ago. Overrated are streetcars. Underrated are rapid transit lines, that is to say, U-Bahn and S-Bahn. Now, I do have a map of things to some extent. It's called Berlin Full. And I'm gonna hope that my computer can load two big maps at the same time, and if not, I'm just gonna X Queens subway. I'm just gonna Queens subway. So, solid lines include lines that are a thing in Berlin. So the S-Bahn, this is the ring, north-south tunnel, it's kind of farther in branch than the rest. Stadtbahn, that's the east-west elevated line. Colored lines indicate subways. So this is a line that's actually been proposed by a citizen advocacy. I mean, I didn't invent it from whole cloth. So this kind of southeastern line has a lot of demand. It's kind of the only line that isn't properly connected to its own dedicated path, because the rest kind of turn into either branches of the tunnel or of the Stadtbahn. And this line instead just reverse branches to everything, and instead this should just get its own connection to an already under construction tunnel over here, which is called the S21. They are planning instead to make S21 into another north-south trunk line, but these are not necessary, they're not at capacity. So they should just make it this. And then either go to Gesundbrunnen for more Hauptbahnhof to Gesundbrunnen service. So the dotted lines here to Tegel are kind of speculative. And then instead of building an U-Bahn on this alignment, I'm just not depicting it because I don't know the exact alignment or number of stations. This is the Siemensbahn that's actually being built. So the main thing that I'm highlighting is this part. So Potsdamer Platz to the Görlitzerbahn. The other thing is a line that's called U10, which was partly built, generally at the intersections it's been built. They did have plans. The plans for it beyond Potsdamer Platz were different. They were to go I believe whip, and instead of this alignment they're building a streetcar, but you might notice that this is directly parallel to the north-south tunnel and serves basically the same destinations, so why build it? I mean, back in the Cold War they were thinking about it because they thought, it's kind of weird, in the Cold War kind of the East got the S-Bahn, so even in the West the S-Bahn was operated by the East for the benefit of the Westerners, that is, to extract money from Westerners, because East Germany always wanted hard cash. And the West kind of got the U-Bahn, except U5 and parts of U2. So U8 ran non-stop under the East, and U6 kind of did as well. And so the West was planning the U-Bahn without any regard for the S-Bahn. This is why you're seeing extensions like U7 kind of paralleling the S-Bahn. And they long had this extension of U8 paralleling the S-Bahn here as well. And finally they were going to build to Märkisches Viertel, but it's being underrated in the sense that they're saying they're starting to plan, but it will not be built before 2030, while all the streetcars that they wanted are going to be a lot slower. Not to Märkisches Viertel, of course, but to inner parts of the city will be finished earlier, in the 20s. So the main underrated things are just prioritization, so U8 to Märkisches Viertel, this connection between the Görlitzerbahn and Potsdamer Platz, subway, again not this route, but the U6 branch to Tegel, the now disused airport that they're going to redevelop. Also there are plans for U7 to the airport, but I mean there's already so much S-Bahn service here. There's a lot of regional service in addition to the S-Bahn, so I mean I could take or leave. U10 is maybe more speculative. This is I believe, like, this direction is the strongest trams in the city because the East didn't throw away the trams the way the West did. And so now they're kind of extending the trams back to the West. And again, along an alignment that serves A serves rich people, B who already have an S-Bahn that was being ignored in division era plans, but really shouldn't be. So don't build on this alignment, kind of divert here and build and connect this to the existing U3 maybe. So anyway, that is underrated lines in the cities I've lived in. I'm not going to do every underrated lines because, or rather, line rather, things that aren't plural. Just because I can spend hours in just, for example, Los Angeles or Tokyo, San Francisco, London, maybe Rome. So again, it's a very broad topic, so I only did the busiest few lines. Is there any way I could fix up the missed connections on the G? Okay, thoughts on the G going up Astoria? No, don't have the G go up Astoria. That's again I mean, Astoria is a radial, don't turn it into a circumferential. Even if you have this component on 86 straightened out. Is it Christy Clark's fault? The referendum, yes, the referendum was a problem. And Translate kind of botched it. There was a transit funding referendum that so in the election, in I think 2013, I believe, the NDP, so in British Columbia, the Conservatives kind of don't exist as a provincial party, so instead the Liberals became the right-wing party instead of the center-left one that they are federally. And then for center-left stuff, you just vote for the New Democrats, who are federally the left party. So you have BC Liberals and NDP. NDP was ahead in the polls. They said they would fund transit. BC Liberals said they'd take it to a referendum. NDP unexpectedly lost, and BC Liberals said, okay, let's do the referendum a couple years later, after it left. I think maybe 2015, 16. And it was at the peak of public mistrust of TransLink because it happened right after the rollout of the new smart card system and the fare gates on SkyTrain, both of which were horrifically botched. Now, they were botched because it was foisted on SkyTrain by politicians. I forget if Christy Clark was literally the politician who pressured that, but there was a lot of center-right pressure with a lot of moral panicking regarding fare evasion. And a lot of lobbying by Cubic, which is the defense contractor that turned itself into America's smart card provider and has been doing a cock-up job of it in Boston. To the point that Boston is looking at making the buses free just to avoid having to deal with weird bus fare media. Just because what is called AFC 2.0, so that's the automated fare system that they're planning, is being so delayed. So they likewise screwed over Vancouver. And the referendum happened at a time of peak mistrust and lost. But, I mean, the cost overruns were probably going to happen either way. Like, I don't think the cost overruns happened from post-referendum redesign. So, yes, part of it is Christy Clark's fault, but not all of it. Okay. Yes, crayon is a British term. Berlin Greens, why they're so fixated on trams. Ooh, excellent question. Historic drama. So, in Germany, as in most of the Western world, tramways were removed after World War II. Unlike in, for example, America or France, tramways were replaced with subways. So the idea was that you would take a city tramway system, you would take the busiest downtown link, put it underground, and then branch outside to create a Stadtbahn system, or to create something called subway surface in America. Now, the Greens are pissed that they did this to give cars more space in city center. So there's this kind of meme that subways are almost like a conspiracy by pro-car interests to give more road space to cars that should belong to transit. Add that a lot of new left hostility to speed. I mean, I believe Germany is also the place where you start seeing people saying, "Oh, well, cars aren't fast because if you count how much money you have to spend on them and you convert that to earning power, then the speed of a car is less than that of a bicycle," or something like that. So these are people who think in terms of slow speeds. In France, the Greens are still against the high-speed train system. They want to slow down all the trains to 200 kilometers an hour. Not even in the sense of, oh, France made a historic mistake and let's invest in the legacy railroad. No, they're saying take the existing trains, slow them to 200. The Greens in Germany are more reasonable, but they still think that bikes and tramways are kind of more moral than subways. That is a problem. Is the issue with reverse branching less city center capacity? Yes. So actually there are two issues. This is one of them. The other issue is when you interline, and even if, let's say, you have two lines through city center, and they kind of run parallel, and then outside there are two lines that run parallel, and maybe you want to have a weave in which all four combos happen. So it's like each, let's say, line going outside city center and with each city center trunk, so 2 by 2. So this technically conserves capacity, but not really, because the more branching you have in your system, the more delays propagate. So if you have lines that share tracks in like one big graph, as is the case in New York City, well, on the lettered lines that are not the L, then the issue is that there's a delays on one line propagate with the others, so your system is less reliable. And yes, this cuts your capacity. In London, they found it with the current state of interlining on the northern line, so both north and south. There are two reverse branches through city center. Right now, on the busier of the two northern line branches, So this is going to be a weird London map because if you're used to the London map, you're used to the schematic, and I'm showing the geographic one. So the northern line is the main north-south line. In the south, there's only one trunk, but here at Kennington, the reverse branch point, there are 10 tracks, so it's not quite just everything has to funnel on these 2 tracks. And then trains can go through Bank, so there's this reverse branch, or they can go via Charing Cross. Charing Cross is busier weekends and off-peak. Bank is busier at rush hour because 9-to-5 jobs in finance. And so they're trying to cram as many trains into the Bank branch, especially from, I think, the north, as they can. I think it's busier from the north than the south, but there's lots of white-collar, middle-class both ends. And with the current state of this branching, it's 28 trains per hour at the peak. Now, when the Battersea extension, which London is currently building from Kennington to Battersea, and you might think, oh, it's going to pass through Vauxhall, right? No, it's not. They decided in their infinite wisdom to deliberately not build this transfer and not even make it possible in the future because they're trying to get people not to take the Victoria line, which is very crowded. So Battersea is going to just go to Charing Cross, and what is currently the main line, so Morden is going to just go to Bank. So with that part, so with the south unbranched, they can get 32 trains per hour, and then when they do upgrades on the reverse branch point here, which is not Morningham Crossing, it's Camden Town, so the tracks here don't have a cross-platform transfer, so the passageways are very narrow, so they're going to add passageways, and when they do so, they can, I don't know which gets paired with what, but they're going to just turn the northern line into 2 operationally separate lines, and then they say that's going to go not just from 28 to 32, but actually to 36. So yes, this does create capacity problems, but it's separate from the weighted capacity. This is just a matter of reliability. Yes, high-speed trains emit way less carbon dioxide than, not so much legacy rail. It's less CO. I mean, it's usually a little bit less CO2 intensive but that's mostly because the trains run at constant speed. So if you run the train at a lower constant speed, but still on the line with high quality, you would, by the trains themselves, consume less electricity. It's just that people would then switch back to cars and to flying, which is a lot more CO2 intensive. No, with Battersea, the southern part is going to be unbranched, but the northern part won't, because they're still upgrading Camden Town. Okay, so High Barnet is the one that gets back. Okay. I think I got one more question. For some reason the mouse scroll is being weird. So the UK has problems with, it's not electrifying a lot. They're starting to, but they have a lot of problems, some of which are incompetent, some of which are genuine problems with the state of the infrastructure. The bridges in Britain are very low, and this increases electrification costs because you don't have clearance, and in fact the bridges are arched, which is a problem. So the bridge goes like this. The pantograph is flat, so that is actually a problem. They've had to invent a surge arrestor, which lets you do a high voltage catenary with much tighter clearances. Usually you need a clearance of about 1 centimeter per kilovolt. So the German standards are 15 kilovolts. Static clearance between the wire and fixed structure is 15 centimeters. If it's 25, for example, if you're trying to connect to France, then it's 27 centimeters. So roughly linear, give or take. And in Britain, the standards normally are about the same, give or take, but they found a way to do surge arrestors to avoid having arcs from a distance, to the point that the clearances can be much smaller. I'm forgetting how much smaller, but it was told comparable to direct current, so close to 0. just because, and they needed to do this kind of fancy stuff just because they have these very low bridges. But that's a British-specific problem. Yeah. So anyway, this is why Britain is not very electrified. They're trying. Not very well, but they're trying. Okay, are there any other questions? Because again, I don't want to get sucked into London cramming, because London is one of these cities where talking about one street in London can take an entire day. It's a little bit like New York that way. Again, I'm gonna give it as in previous casts. I'm gonna give it 2 more minutes, because I know there's a little bit of I know that I'm lagging a little bit, so I don't want to say any questions and then you type, but I didn't get to say it. Is my Tokyo underrated, extending the Tsukuba Express to Shinjuku? Oh my god. Yes, but not just. I mean, there are a bunch of extensions that Tokyo needs to build. Tokyo generally has this problem where they're only going to build, like in Japan, they're only going to build subways if the operating profits are going to pay back construction costs in 30 years, which is insane. They're asking for 3.3% returns. Japanese interest rates are less than 3.3%. Okay, so in Japan, just subways in general are underrated. They demand 3.3% ROI, but there's private financing for the Chuo Shinkansen at much less than 3.3%. They're talking about, so they're starting to build it now. They're planning to open 2027. I believe there may have been a delay to Osaka. I'm forgetting, late 30s, maybe 40s. And they're talking about taking until the end of the 21st century to pay down the debt. That's not 3.3%. That's like 1 point something percent, 1.5% maybe. And that's private financing. So why does Japan insist on 3.3%? I have no idea. The lines that are marginal, at least judging by ridership projections, they seem very healthy. So just build it. Anything to be doing? Anything with the blue line on the T? Yes, there is something called 2045. Thanks. With the T, there's something called the red blue connector. I don't want to call it underrated because it is actively being studied, and forgetting whether it was just us yelling at the T. So every pair of the 4 Boston subway lines intersects with a transfer in downtown Boston, except the red and the blue, which are so goddamn close. Blue, red. So this is a wide street. It's very easy to extend, but the previous mayor Menino, previous mayor Menino didn't want the project, so he sandbagged it and said it would have to be bored. This is about 600 meters. He said the cost would be, I believe, $750 million. One of these cancelled lines. I mean, again, if a line is really expensive, it might get cancelled. If people don't want to build a line, they might sandbag it and make it look more expensive. Bottom line, after we yelled, they're studying a cut and cover option because the blue line is so shallow that that's kind of the only way to do it. For about 250 mil, which is still very expensive for cut and cover. It's gonna beat the Taipei Metro for the most expensive cut and cover in the world, I believe. But 250 is not 750. So it's being actively studied, and it's small enough in scope that it's not really competing with regional rail, which is, if you ask me, about 5 billion, not including the Harlem tunnel. 4 or 5 billion, I guess. So this is something that can be done with the blue line. But it's not underrated because it is being, underrated, I think, of things that are not being built or not being planned or being planned with ridiculously long time horizons based on the city's norms. In Boston, it's going to take ridiculously long, but that's because American norms are things take forever because America is bad at infrastructure. Are there any German cities that left their trams instead of building a subway? Yes, Leipzig. Like in general, like in East Germany, so East Berlin, Leipzig. I have no idea about Russland, but I know that Leipzig has actually a really high transit involvement. So the city itself, I believe, is 25%. The metro area would be a lot less because the city is 500,000. The metro area is probably more than 1 million, maybe 1.5 million. But the definition of metro area in German is kind of wonky, but you look at the S-Bahn reach in Leipzig, for example. So yes, Leipzig absolutely still has trams, and an S-Bahn tunnel. So yeah, so Warsaw has trams and a subway. I believe Warsaw has trams at least. Prague, Budapest. I think actually the busiest tramways in the world are, I don't know what order, Paris, St. Petersburg, Paris, St. Petersburg, Prague, Budapest. What does common law contribute to high costs? Nothing. Common law did not associate with high costs until the late 20th century. And Canada and Singapore only realigned with Anglo-American high-cost norms in the last 10 or 15 years. It's not common law. Quebec uses civil law for private law, and it's the same. And it's the same construction cost as English Canada. It's just political trends. It's social political trends. It's kind of like thinking that the United States and Britain are places to emulate. This is literally what it means. And Quebec, for all of its pretensions, thinks that the United States and Britain are places to emulate. It just, instead of privatizing the state to British and American corporations, it does so to French ones. But it's the same kind of privatization of the state. Do I think the Hong Kong rail plus property model could be incorporated in any other major city? I mean, any major city that hates its that hates its residents could do it. I mean, a city that. You want a city that's really expensive. You want to have cartelization of housing in the way Hong Kong does. You want you absolutely can do it. You absolutely can turn. You absolutely can have the state make a profit off of overcrowded housing. I don't know where, because I'm not really trying to investigate where bad things can be implemented, but I think other cities could do it. Japanese or Korean models are much better, or Taiwanese. I mean, Taiwan's construction costs are insane, but rail plus property would not make it better. I mean, Hong Kong construction costs are worse than Taipei construction costs. The model that you want for subways is the city builds a subway, private developers build buildings. That's it. And yes, in Japan there is a little bit of rail plus property. A, not on the subway, only on commuter rail. B, on things that they're not privatized, they were never public. C, it's not overcrowded. On the contrary, there's very liberal zoning. D, this is a synergy. So the idea is that the trains generate demand for the property fills the trains. E, these private companies have to pay full market value for the land. It's not like with the MTR that's getting state land for the price of undeveloped land without a bid. No, Japan is not Hong Kong. Japan is better governed than Hong Kong. In Japan, you can say things like the country committed war crimes, or the prime minister is a fascist piece of shit, and not be summoned to a national security law thing and whisked over to China or any other country. Are there any other questions? Ideally, things that are not about common law or high cost, but about underrated projects, but which I get is like a very disjointed thing. I just was talking about random cities. I mean, cities chosen for the fact that they lived there because there's no other way to list them. But if not, I'll end around 8 as usual. So again, I was trying to avoid crowning, but I don't think there's a good theme that connects all of the underrated cases. I mean, I guess you could connect the New York and Providence ones based on poverty, because 125th Street is through Harlem. Harlem is a poor neighborhood. But the thing is, Harlem is not a neglected neighborhood. It's a neighborhood that people, if anything, think is less poor than it actually is. In Providence, it's about neglected neighborhoods, and it's about the commuter rail being viewed as for the rich. In Vancouver, that's not terribly relevant because the commuter lines in Vancouver are very poorly placed. The CP line, so it's this one. It's next to it. I mean, half of the station radius is wasted on ships. The other half is wasted on. Look at the elevation here. Look at the elevation here. How many people do you think? And if there were a train station, let's say at this bridge, how many people do you think go from here to the train station? So in Vancouver, it's something completely different. I mean, it's just weird politicized priorities. In Paris, I guess the same theme of people underinvesting in poor people is the thing. There's this idea that if you invest in the poor suburbs, you have to build in the suburbs rather than build in the city for the train that takes people from the suburbs to the city, which is kind of weird because in New York they understand that. In New York, East Side Access is being built within the city, but it's viewed as a suburban project. Governor Pataki, whose base is Long Island White Flighters, traded that horse with city-based Assembly Speaker Sheldon Silver 20 years ago. Silver got second half of Subway Phase 1, hoping that Phase 4, which would serve as district, would eventually be built. Pataki got ESA, and by got, I mean ESA will open eventually. Which city discriminates least? I have no idea. I mentioned LA. What do we do? The top 3 lines. South Vermont is one of them. I don't know the other 2 because I don't remember I don't remember their current plan. I mean, so I think they do have something on Sepulveda. At least they have that. Probably a second radial, but I can't think. Oh, Whittier. The Purple Line should keep going east from Union Station on Whittier. Instead, they did this weird C on the Gold Line, which I mean, it's gonna turn into an Expo line. East part in LA, but they built the Gold Line east side on the wrong streets. They built on first and third, whereas the main center of East LA is Whittier. Do cities with low costs do cut and cover in a single segment at once to minimize disruption, or multiple ones? So I don't know because cut and cover is not that common actually. But even with DPMs, cities do build things several places at once. I mean, there's lots of I mean, Madrid doesn't drill one subway tunnel as one TBM going start to end. They do several launch boxes. Yes, Harlem is gentrifying, but I mean, but when you say gentrifying, bear in mind that the zip code, I think the zip codes of central Harlem are something like 70% black, and the rest is not all white. I mean, there's a lot of it is Hispanic. And in New York, Hispanics and blacks are, in New York, not quite, but very similar to the same caste, because there's a lot of integration between Puerto Ricans, Dominicans, and African Americans in New York. So when you talk about gentrification, bear in mind we're talking about neighborhoods that are a lot less white than neighborhoods in Europe that are called ghettos and no-go zones. How many jobs in a district? I don't know. It's relative. It's relative to the city size. It's relative to linearity. So a linear city like Wuppertal can build rapid transit at lower size and lower job concentration. It depends on residential density. So more residential density means you need less. You need a less prominent CBD to justify subway. It's a very. I mean, public transit is about connecting people from where they live to where they're going to go, which is work, school, socialization, errands. So I want to say it's about the product of these 2 densities, but it's a lot more complicated than that. So I can't give you a number on just one of them, because the other one also matters. Same reason I don't talk about minimum density threshold for residences. I mean, it depends on what you're connecting them to. Are there case studies about HSR that I would recommend? I do not. It's possible that there are. I've been reading literature about HSR construction, but mostly it's people talking about the problems in, for example, Taiwan and Korea. The thing is, you never have slam dunks, because if you have a line that's a huge slam dunk, it means that you needed to have built it 30 years before. So Taiwan, for example, built high-speed rail at high cost, to be fair, right when it could. Korea, same thing. So these lines looked kind of treading water, because yes, they could have waited 15 more years, but then they would have missed out on all the benefits of high-speed rail having existed in the intermediate 15 years. So I have read studies that I would not recommend about that claim China built high-speed rail cheaper because the World Bank doesn't do PPP adjustment. But I don't know any good studies. We might write one. It depends on whether we're funded for that. Any last questions before I close for the day? The week, I guess. By the way, when I mention the famous study about the Madrid metro extensions, bear in mind we're talking about a 5-page report. And it's 5 pages with lots of pictures and tables, so it's not 5,000 words or anything. Like, I wish this were a long study like the one we're writing. Thanks very much, Rob, and I will, unless there's really big problem with the recording that I'm unaware of, I will upload to YouTube. So ciao ciao, and I will see you guys in a week. Yeah, I know. Americans have weird pronunciations, and it's kind of weird to know when they pronounce things the British way and when they try to pronounce it phonetically all over New England. So it's Warwick, but it's Reading, not Reading. It's Reedville, not Redville. New England is weird. New England's just a weird place. Thanks, guys. Ciao, ciao.